Picture this. A candle flickers in the stillness of a quiet library. Shadows crawl across shelves lined with leather-bound volumes, their spines cracked with centuries of handling. The air smells faintly of dust, old paper, and something deeper, the scent of time itself. You run your hand along the bindings, feeling the texture of stitched leather and gold leaf, pausing on a book that seems out of place. Its title is faded, but its weight feels heavy in your grasp. You open it, and inside, the first page tells a story that makes no sense. A span of centuries, gone, erased, as though the Earth simply skipped ahead in its orbit while no one noticed. It is called the phantom time hypothesis. A theory that whispers the unthinkable, that nearly 300 years of our history never happened at all. If you follow this idea, the year isn't truly 2025. It's closer to 1728. And all the medieval tales we know from that missing window. The wars, the kings, the saints, the castles rising stone by stone. Their shadows on the wall. Elaborate illusions, crafted not by chance, but by deliberate human hands. Some say those hands belong to Holy Roman Emperor Otto III, eager to rule in the year 1000, a date thick with apocalyptic expectation and divine symbolism. Others point to Pope Sylvester II, whose power and influence may have been amplified by such a fabrication. Still others whisper of Byzantine emperors, hungry to align their dynasties with a reshaped timeline. But before we wander too far into speculation, we must start at the beginning, with a German historian named Heribert Illig, who first dared to say aloud what most historians would consider blasphemy, that a great portion of the Middle Ages never existed. So settle in, let the clock slow, the firelight dim, and let us walk together into a space between years, a corridor of time where centuries dissolve, and the walls between reality and invention grow thin. Chapter 1. The Man Who Stole Centuries in the Pale Winter Light of 1986. Heribert Illig was just another historian with a fascination for the patterns of the past. But unlike most of his peers, Illig had an ear for what was missing. He noticed the silences between events, the unnatural pauses in the flow of recorded history. And in those silences he began to suspect something was terribly wrong. Illig was a meticulous man. He studied timelines the way a watchmaker studies gears, searching for misalignments, for the subtle click that falls out of rhythm. And it was during his research into the early medieval period, particularly the years between 614 and 911 AD, that his watch began to skip. The first thing he noticed was the scarcity of credible historical documents from this period. Yes, there were chronicles, but many were suspiciously similar, as if copied from one another rather than observed firsthand. Records felt thin, repetitive, and oddly derivative. Major events were few, and even those felt hazy at the edges, lacking the sharp definition of lived experience. Then came the architectural gap. Archaeology should have revealed a continuous evolution of building styles, pottery designs, and material culture. Yet Illig found, not nothing, but suspiciously little. For nearly 3 centuries, material evidence seemed sparse, and what existed felt strangely misplaced, as if it had been retrofitted into the wrong part of history. And then there was Charlemagne, the great king, the unifier of Europe, the man whose name looms large over medieval history. Illig began to suspect he might not have existed at all. Or at least, not in the form we know. The accounts of his reign felt strangely exaggerated, his accomplishments impossibly vast for a single lifetime. It was as though Charlemagne were less a man than a symbol, a composite stitched together from the deeds of several rulers and the imagination of later historians. The more Illig looked, the stranger it became. He began to wonder if those missing centuries had been inserted into history on purpose, that somewhere in the medieval past, powerful figures had conspired to move the calendar forward, fabricating events to fill the space. His theory crystallized into what he would later call the phantom time hypothesis. It proposed that the years 614 to 911 AD never actually happened. Instead, this period was invented, with its events forged by rulers seeking political advantage. The calendar was adjusted accordingly, so that the world would believe they were living in the dawn of a new millennium. But why would anyone do such a thing? Why risk the wrath of scholars, the exposure of the lie? Illig's answer was bold. He believed the scheme was orchestrated by Otto III, Holy Roman Emperor, in collaboration with Pope Sylvester II, and possibly Byzantine Emperor Constantine VII. Otto, he claimed, wanted to legitimize his rule by placing himself at the spiritually potent year 1000 AD, a date rich with apocalyptic expectation and symbolic renewal. By skipping ahead in the calendar, Otto could style himself not merely as a ruler, but as the chosen monarch of the millennial kingdom. This was not a minor historical adjustment, it was a temporal heist, the theft of centuries themselves. Illig's proposal landed like a stone in a still pond. Some laughed. Others called it pseudo-history. But a few leaned closer, curious. Because in the deep currents of archaeology, astronomy, and chronicle records, there were peculiar shadows that seemed to match his outline. And as Illig began to gather his evidence, the mystery only deepened. Chapter 2. The Missing Centuries. The theory begins with an absence. In most periods of human history, centuries leave their fingerprints everywhere, in architecture, in burial sites, in shifting languages, in the detritus of daily life. But when Illig looked closely at the years between 614 and 911 AD, the fingerprints smudged, and in some places, disappeared entirely. He likened it to turning the pages of a book, only to find that entire chapters had been printed with the same sentences rearranged. Yes, something is written there, but it doesn't quite feel like the story was lived. Take Western Europe in the so-called early Middle Ages. This was supposedly a time when kingdoms were forming, Christianity was spreading, and rulers were rising to unify vast territories. But when archaeologists dig into the soil of this period, they don't find a steady stream of new styles, techniques, and tools. Instead, they find artifacts that look older than they should, almost like leftovers from centuries before. Pottery is a prime example. Styles evolve quickly. A generation or two is enough to see noticeable changes in design, shape, and decoration. But for this phantom stretch of time, pottery remains oddly static. In some regions, there's barely any change at all for hundreds of years, as if the potters simply stopped innovating. Buildings tell a similar story. Where we should see architectural transitions, new fortifications, churches, and civic structures, we often see suspiciously sudden shifts, as though whole eras of development were skipped. It is as though the world fell into a kind of cultural sleep. Even the historical records for these centuries seem thin. We have chronicles, but many appear to be copies of older works, adjusted slightly to fit new rulers into old templates. A king dies, another rises, but their deeds feel strangely repetitive, their wars echoing the conflicts of earlier ages. And when we turn to science for confirmation, the timeline begins to fray even further. Chapter 3. The Case of Emperor Charlemagne. If the phantom time hypothesis has a poster child, it is Charlemagne. Charles the Great, the ruler credited with uniting much of Europe under the Holy Roman Empire in the late 8th and early 9th centuries. Charlemagne is a towering figure in medieval history. He is said to have conquered vast territories, reformed laws, standardized coinage, encouraged learning, and spread Christianity far and wide. He was crowned emperor by the Pope himself in the year 800 AD. His name became a touchstone for power and unity. And yet, when Illig examined the records, the Charlemagne story began to wobble. For one thing, the scope of his accomplishments seemed improbably vast for a single reign. Could one man, in an age of slow communication and grueling travel, truly have micromanaged reforms across such an enormous territory while also waging near-constant war? Then there were the physical relics. For such a monumental ruler, Charlemagne left behind surprisingly few contemporary artifacts that can be definitively linked to him. Most depictions and biographies come from much later, centuries after his supposed lifetime, raising the possibility that he was partly or entirely a literary construction. Some scholars even suggest that Charlemagne may be a composite, a blend of several rulers whose deeds were stitched together to create a legendary figure, much like the mythical King Arthur. This would not have been unusual in the medieval world, where propaganda often blurred the line between truth and fiction. If Charlemagne was exaggerated, or worse, fabricated outright, then an enormous pillar of early medieval history collapses, and with it, much of the structure that supports our current timeline. And Illig was just getting started. Chapter 4. Astronomy's Silent Witness. One of the most intriguing and troubling pieces of Illig's case came not from dusty manuscripts or broken pottery, but from the stars themselves. Astronomy, unlike human memory, is precise. Celestial events follow predictable cycles, and historical records of these events can be cross-checked with modern calculations. If an eclipse was recorded in the year 775, for example, we can determine with great accuracy whether such an eclipse should have been visible in that location at that time. When researchers applied this method to certain medieval records, some dates simply didn't align. Illig seized on this, arguing that the misalignments were the fingerprints of a forged timeline. Take the example of Halley's Comet. It appears in Earth's skies roughly every 76 years, a spectacle so dramatic it's been recorded since antiquity. Ancient Chinese astronomers tracked it meticulously. But in European records there are strange gaps, appearances that should be there but aren't noted, or sightings that don't match the expected dates. Illig suggested that these discrepancies pointed to something more than sloppy record-keeping. They hinted at events being retroactively assigned to incorrect years, forcing celestial data to clash with the official calendar. Eclipses too posed problems. Some medieval eclipse records didn't correspond to any actual eclipse that should have occurred at that location and time. If the timeline were shifted, say by adding or removing centuries, those mismatches could suddenly make sense. In other words, the sky itself might be telling us that our history is not what we think it is. Chapter 5. The Julian to Gregorian calendar. Shift calendars are the heartbeat of civilization. They mark harvests, holy days, tax collection, and the reigns of kings. But even the most carefully maintained calendars drift over time, because the solar year is not exactly 365 days. By the 16th century, the Julian calendar, used in Europe since the time of Julius Caesar, had drifted about 10 days out of sync with the solar year. To fix this, Pope Gregory XIII introduced the Gregorian calendar in 1582, which skipped 10 days to realign the dates with the seasons. But here's the thing. If the Julian calendar had been in continuous use since 45 BC, the drift by 1582 should have been closer to 13 days, not 10. That's a difference of about 3 centuries. Illig argued that this was no coincidence. It was exactly the length of the phantom period he claimed had been inserted into history. If those years had never actually passed, the calendar drift would be smaller, exactly as observed in 1582. Mainstream historians counter that other adjustments and errors could account for the discrepancy. But for Illig, this was another piece of the puzzle. Hard, numerical evidence that our calendar contains centuries that were never lived. Chapter 6. The medieval chronicle gap. Written history is a patchwork quilt, stitched together from royal decrees, monastery annals, travelers' accounts, and the scattered observations of countless scribes. But when you examine the quilt of the early medieval period, something feels off. Many chronicles from 614 to 911 AD are suspiciously derivative. Monks copying earlier works often inserted new rulers into old narratives without adding fresh details. Entire decades pass with only vague mentions of battles, famines, or plagues, described in formulaic language, almost as if they were stock events pulled from a template. This is not unheard of in history. Chroniclers often borrowed from earlier sources, but the scale here is unsettling. For nearly 3 centuries, the richness of lived history feels muted, replaced by repetition and recycling. Illig likened it to a forged painting. At a glance, it seems authentic, but when you look closely, you notice the brushstrokes repeating, the same patterns appearing in places they shouldn't. If the missing centuries were fabricated, then the chroniclers of later periods may have unknowingly been filling in a blank stretch of time with invented or reshaped material. An elaborate act of historical backfilling that we now take as truth. And that perhaps is the most haunting aspect of the phantom time hypothesis. If it's true, then for centuries we have been telling each other a story that was never real. Chapter 7. Archaeology's quiet gaps. If history is a book, then archaeology is the footnote that tells us whether the story matches reality. Stones don't lie. Pottery shards, bones, tools. They carry the memory of their creation in the shape of their edges, the composition of their clay, the style of their design. And yet, for the years between 614 and 911 AD, the Earth seems strangely silent. Across much of Europe, archaeologists encounter long stretches where cultural evolution slows to a crawl. Buildings from the late Roman period remain in use well into what should be the Middle Ages, with little modification. Coins are rare, and when they appear, they often resemble older designs rather than showing the natural progression you'd expect over centuries. In Germany, England, France, and Italy, settlement patterns show unusual continuity. Villages appear unchanged for hundreds of years, without the incremental expansions or shifts that normally come with population growth, trade, or warfare. Some defenders of traditional history argue that this was simply the Dark Ages. a time of economic stagnation and low population after the collapse of the Roman Empire. But Illig countered that even in decline, human societies leave distinct archaeological layers over time. The absence of change is not a sign of slow development, it's a sign of missing time. He pointed to burial customs as another anomaly. Funerary practices tend to evolve with religious beliefs, available materials, and cultural contact. But here too, the period seems strangely static. Styles remain locked in patterns that barely shift until, suddenly, new forms appear, as though someone jumped ahead in the script without writing the middle acts. It is as if these centuries exist as a shallow layer of dust over deeper, more authentic history, a manufactured chapter in the Book of Time, waiting to be peeled away. Chapter 8. The Byzantine Connection. If the phantom time hypothesis were merely an odd quirk of European chronology, it might be easier to dismiss, but Illig found tantalizing threads reaching far beyond the Holy Roman Empire, threads that wound their way east into the golden mosaics and candlelit halls of Byzantium. At the heart of the Byzantine world in the early 11th century was Emperor Constantine VII Porphyrogenetos, born in the purple, as the title declared, signaling his birth into imperial privilege. But Constantine was more than a ruler. He was a historian, a man obsessed with documenting and legitimizing his dynasty. Illig suggested that Constantine may have been a willing participant in calendar manipulation, aligning Byzantine history with a restructured European timeline. Why? Because such a shift could enhance the prestige of his reign, linking it more closely to significant Christian milestones, and reinforcing his authority as the guardian of the true faith. Byzantium was a master of political theater. Court ceremonies were choreographed down to the placement of each candle, the color of each robe, the very scent of incense drifting through the air. History in such a world was not merely recorded, it was crafted, curated and performed. If the West needed missing centuries to elevate the Holy Roman Emperor to the symbolic year 1000, the East could benefit too. It would bring their own histories into neat alignment with prophetic expectations, cementing a shared Christian chronology that both sides could use to their advantage. In this way, the alleged conspiracy would not be a single empire's invention, but a collaboration across the two great pillars of Christendom, Rome and Constantinople, each reshaping time for its own ends. Chapter 9. The Papal Plot Theory. In the shadowy corners of the phantom time hypothesis lies one of its most controversial elements, the suggestion that the papacy itself may have been involved. Illig pointed to Pope Sylvester II, a learned man who reigned at the turn of the first millennium. Known for his intellect, Sylvester was steeped in astronomy, mathematics and the mechanics of timekeeping. He had traveled widely, studied with scholars in Muslim Spain, and brought advanced knowledge back to the Christian world. If anyone in the West could have manipulated the calendar with precision, it was Sylvester. According to Illig, the Pope's role in a fabricated millennium could have been to sanctify the deception, lending divine authority to a scheme that would place both church and emperor in a position of unparalleled symbolic power. Imagine the scene. The year 1000 approaches, a date rich with apocalyptic expectation. The faithful across Christendom look to Rome for guidance. And there stands the Pope, beside the Holy Roman Emperor, proclaiming an age of renewal. Not because history had reached that point naturally, but because they had moved the goalposts. It's a bold accusation. Mainstream historians dismiss it as implausible, citing the complexity of forging centuries of records and convincing a continent to accept them. But Illig insisted that the medieval world's fragmented communication and reliance on religious authority made such a feat more achievable than we might imagine. Chapter 10. The Holy Roman Empire's motivation. At the center of Illig's theory is Otto III, Holy Roman Emperor from 996 to 1002. Otto was a visionary, or some would say a dreamer. He saw himself not merely as a ruler, but as the reviver of the Roman Empire's grandeur, a Christian emperor presiding over a reborn world. And what better way to crown that vision than by ruling in the year 1000, a number dripping with theological weight. The turn of the millennium carried deep symbolic power in the medieval mind. Many believed it would usher in the second coming of Christ, or at least a transformation of the world order. By shifting the calendar forward, Otto could step into history as the emperor of the millennium, the divinely chosen leader of a new age. Illig argued that Otto, with the cooperation of the Pope and possibly the Byzantine emperor, could have overseen the creation of forged documents, adjusted regnal lists, and inserted entirely fabricated events into the historical record. The logistics sound daunting today, but in an age when literacy was rare and most people's sense of time came from the church bell rather than the written page, a coordinated effort among the elite could plausibly reshape the calendar without widespread resistance. If Otto truly did this, then every history book we read today is built on a false foundation, the product of a medieval ruler's ambition to stand at the symbolic center of time. Chapter 11. Counter-arguments and critics. Not everyone was convinced. In fact, the majority of historians reject the phantom time hypothesis outright. Critics argue that there is ample archaeological evidence for the period Illig claims was invented, from buildings dated by dendrochronology, tree ring analysis, to coins and manuscripts that can be confidently placed in the supposed phantom centuries. They contend that gaps and repetitions in the record can be explained by the genuine instability of the early Middle Ages, a time when wars, plagues, and population decline slowed cultural change. Astronomers too push back. While Illig pointed to inconsistencies in eclipse and comet records, others note that medieval chroniclers often misdated celestial events due to poor record-keeping, local weather obscuring observations, or copying errors introduced over generations. The Gregorian calendar discrepancy, they say, is not mysterious at all. It can be explained by variations in how the Julian calendar was implemented, along with adjustments made before 1582. For many scholars, the phantom time hypothesis is less a revelation, and more a fascinating thought experiment, a reminder that history is always, to some degree, a constructed narrative, but not proof that centuries were literally invented. And yet, the theory endures, because even if it's wrong, it taps into something unsettling. The idea that time itself might be a human invention, vulnerable to the ambitions of those who control the pen. Chapter 12. Alternative time theories. Illig's phantom time hypothesis is not the only theory to challenge the flow of history. Across the centuries, others have whispered similar suspicions, each dressed in its own peculiar clothing. In the 17th century, Sir Isaac Newton, yes, the same Newton who gave us gravity, became fascinated by chronology. He attempted to reconcile ancient histories from different cultures, and found himself cutting out what he believed were inflated regnal lists and duplicated kings. Though he never proposed that centuries had been fabricated, he did believe history had been stretched and distorted by human hands. Then there was Anatoly Fomenko, a Russian mathematician whose new chronology takes the idea even further than Illig's. Fomenko argues that much of recorded history before the 17th century is an elaborate duplicate, with events in ancient Rome and the Middle Ages being reflections of one another. His conclusions are widely dismissed, but his work shares with Illig's a core suspicion that the timeline we trust may not be the one we truly lived. Even ancient myths hint at missing or altered time. In the Hindu concept of yugas, vast ages pass in cycles, with human history repeating itself again and again. In medieval Europe, apocalyptic thought often framed time as a divine script that could be edited, reset, or reinterpreted according to God's will, or the will of those who claim to speak for him. Each of these ideas, though vastly different in scope, plants the same seed, that our sense of time's passage is fragile, easily rewritten by scribes, priests and rulers who shape the story to suit their needs. Illig's phantom time hypothesis may be the most famous modern version, but it lives in a long tradition of time skepticism, the nagging fear that the past is not a solid foundation, but shifting sand beneath our feet. Chapter 13. The psychology of time manipulation. Why do theories like phantom time captivate us so deeply? Part of it is human vulnerability to narrative. We are creatures of story, and history is the grandest story of all. If someone tells us that a part of that story never happened, it shakes our sense of self. Psychologists have long studied false memory, the way people can be made to remember events that never took place. Entire groups can share the same false memory if the conditions are right: a trusted authority figure, repeated storytelling, and a lack of contradictory evidence. Medieval Europe had all three in abundance. Religious authority provided the ultimate frame for reality. If the Pope or an emperor declared a year to be 1000, who would or could argue? For a largely illiterate population whose daily rhythms were tied to the church calendar, the flow of time itself was mediated through rituals, feast days, and proclamations. There's also the comfort of pattern recognition. Humans look for meaning in numbers, and millennium is one of the most potent patterns we know. It marks the close of one era and the dawn of another. If powerful figures wanted to position themselves as leaders of such a moment, the psychological readiness of the masses would make them eager to believe it. In that way, manipulating time is not merely an act of political power, it is an act of emotional engineering, shaping not just the records of history, but the heartbeat of an entire civilization. Chapter 14. If phantom time were true. Let us imagine for a moment that Illig is right, that the years 614 to 911 AD never existed. The implications ripple outward like rings in a pond. Every event, every lineage, every piece of art or architecture from that stretch of time becomes suspect. Charlemagne, gone. Certain saints and kings, never born. Entire wars, never fought. Even the way we think about technological progress would shift. Inventions we believed were born in the Dark Ages might have appeared much earlier or later. The narrative of a slow climb from the fall of Rome to the Renaissance would collapse, replaced by a more compressed and perhaps more turbulent history. Our relationship to the calendar would also change. The date on every birth certificate, treaty, and historical marker would be wrong. Not by days or months, but by centuries. We would wake up not in 2025, but somewhere around 1728, with the 18th century suddenly not so far behind us. For some, this is a thrilling thought. The idea that we are closer to our ancestors than we realized, that the medieval world is not as distant as the textbooks claim. For others, it is deeply unsettling. If we can lose 300 years to invention, how many more might be illusions? Chapter 15. Lingering shadows in the timeline. Even if Illig's specific claim is false, there are places where the timeline remains oddly thin, where questions outnumber answers. Archaeologists still puzzle over chronological gaps in certain regions, unexplained similarities between widely separated cultures, and documents that appear to have been rewritten to fit later political needs. Sometimes, history is altered not through grand conspiracies, but through smaller, quieter manipulations. A monastery omitting a scandal from its annals, a king commissioning a flattering but fictionalized biography, a chronicler backdating a miracle to strengthen a saint's cult. Over centuries, these small edits accumulate, smoothing over the jagged edges of reality, until the past fits the shape that the present desires. In that sense, phantom time is not just a hypothesis about 3 missing centuries. It is a metaphor for the way history always contains absences, distortions, and silences, spaces where the truth is murky, and perhaps unknowable. Chapter 16. The Silent Monasteries Picture. A monastery in the mist of early morning. The bell tolls, not as a summons to the bustling city, but to the quiet duty of prayer. Stone walls drip with dew. Inside, the scriptorium smells of ink and tallow, and the slow, scratchy rhythm of quills fills the air. In the medieval world, monasteries were more than places of devotion. They were the guardians of time itself. Within their walls, scribes recorded births, deaths, the reigns of kings, the turning of the seasons. They kept the annals of the world in neat columns, adding each year's events like beads on a rosary. But when Heribert Illig studied monastic records from the phantom centuries, he noticed something troubling. A stillness. The entries were sparse, formulaic, and strangely devoid of the local details that breathe life into history. Instead of vivid accounts of storms or plagues, the pages offered flat pronouncements. In this year, there was famine. In this year, there was war. No place names, no personal voices, no signs of the monk who held the quill. One might think this was a sign of hardship, or the darkening of intellectual life, in the so-called Dark Ages. But Illig saw another possibility. Perhaps these years were not recorded in real time at all. Perhaps centuries later, scribes reconstructed them from scraps, filling the emptiness with generic events that could fit anywhere. It's not just the sameness of the entries that's strange. In some monasteries, the entire chain of yearly records halts for decades, then resumes with a sudden burst of detail. Why would monks, whose central duty was to mark time for prayer and feast, abandon the keeping of years, unless there were no years to keep? And so the silence of the monasteries becomes, in Illig's telling, not the absence of history, but the echo of time that never was. Chapter 17. The Vanishing Cities. Cities are living creatures. They grow outward, they rise upward, they crumble and rebuild. Each century leaves its mark in stone, in brick, in the winding of streets and the layering of foundations. Yet in the phantom centuries, some of Europe's most important cities, Paris, Cologne, Milan, seem to slip into a strange stillness. Archaeological digs reveal older Roman structures still in use, well beyond their expected lifespan. Public works like aqueducts and roads show no signs of repair or replacement for centuries. It is as if these cities were placed under glass, frozen in time. Mainstream historians argued that political instability, disease, and economic decline after the fall of Rome could explain the slow pace of urban change. But Illig countered that even during hardship, cities adapt, markets shift, defenses are rebuilt, styles evolve. In the Phantom period, these natural changes seem oddly absent or compressed. In Cologne, for instance, the archaeological record jumps from late Roman remains to high medieval structures with less in between than expected. In Paris, the footprint of the city appears to stagnate before abruptly expanding in the centuries after 911, as if catching up for lost time. Such patterns could be the scars of war, or they could be the marks of a timeline stitched together after the fact, where the slow evolution of cities was too complex to convincingly invent. In Illig's version, the vanishing of cities is not literal destruction. It's the disappearance of the centuries in which they should have grown. Chapter 18. The coinage conundrum. Coins are more than currency. They are miniature proclamations. They bear the faces of rulers, the symbols of power, the mottos of kingdoms. They tell us who claimed authority and when. And in the Phantom centuries they tell a strange story. Numismatists, specialists in historical coins, note that during the early medieval period, the number and variety of coins in Europe drops sharply. Minting slows. Designs remain unchanged for long stretches. In some cases, coins appear centuries before or after their supposed era. For Illig, this is a crucial piece of evidence. If the Phantom centuries never happened, there would be no rulers to mint new coins, and no commerce to demand them. Later forgers and chroniclers might have tried to backfill the gap, but coinage is difficult to fake convincingly across hundreds of years. Consider the reign of Charlemagne, supposedly a prolific minter of coins. While some exist, many are stylistically indistinguishable from those of his predecessors or successors, as though the boundaries between reigns were blurred. Critics say this can be explained by economic collapse and the reuse of older coinage. But Illig asks, why do similar gaps and repetitions appear across multiple regions, in different political contexts? In the language of metal and mint, the Phantom centuries speak a quieter, but perhaps more honest, truth. Chapter 19. The disappearing languages. Languages are restless. Even without outside influence, they change over time, the edges of words wearing down like stones in a river. In Europe, the centuries after Rome's fall saw Latin break apart into the Romance languages, while Germanic tongues evolved toward their modern forms. But Illig saw something odd in this process, a compression of change, as if developments that should have taken 300 years happened in closer to 100. Old High German, for instance, transitions into Middle High German in a remarkably short space of recorded history. Similarly, Old French seems to emerge almost fully formed, with fewer intermediate stages than expected. Linguists attribute this to social upheaval and cultural mixing. Illig, however, wondered if it was a sign that the intermediate centuries were never there. That linguistic jumps are really the result of a condensed timeline. If the Phantom centuries were inserted, the linguistic record would appear exactly as it does. Ancient languages leaping forward as though time had been folded like a sheet of parchment. Chapter 20. Sacred relics in the wrong age. In the medieval world, relics were the heartbeat of faith. A fragment of the true cross, the skull of a martyr, the cloak of a saint. These were treasures beyond gold. Pilgrims traveled for weeks to kneel before them, believing that holiness clung to bone and cloth like light to glass. And yet, some relics associated with the Phantom centuries seem strangely misplaced. Stylistic details, carbon dating, or even the type of container used suggest they belong to earlier or later periods. In some cases, the relic's provenance, their chain of custody, only appears in records written long after their supposed discovery. The earliest mentions often come from times when the political value of possessing such relics was high, and the temptation to find them would have been strong. If those centuries never happened, many relics could have been retroactively assigned to them, bolstering the legitimacy of churches or rulers. A relic found in the year 750, for example, could easily be the same object documented elsewhere in 1050, its history rewritten to fill a phantom space. For believers, the holiness of the object would remain untouched. But for Illig, these relics were another kind of sacred story, one that testified, perhaps unintentionally, to a gap in the true flow of time. Chapter 21. The astrolabe anomaly. It is the 8th century, or so the records tell us. Somewhere along the Mediterranean coast, a merchant unpacks a brass astrolabe, its face engraved with the constellations, its back marked for measuring the height of the sun or the angle of a star. In an age without satellites or mechanical clocks, such a device is both a marvel and a necessity, guiding sailors across black waters and scholars through the motions of the heavens. And yet, when we search for the astrolabe in the phantom centuries, it appears in curious flashes, then vanishes. One account describes its use by scholars in Cordoba, another, in Byzantium, but between these glimpses, silence. If such instruments existed and were valued, why is there not a steady trail of their improvement, distribution and repair? Why do they not leave a denser archaeological and literary footprint? Illig considered the possibility that these scattered references were not contemporary reports, but anachronisms. Details from later centuries pushed backward to fill the phantom gap. A scribe in the 11th century, copying an older work, might unconsciously project familiar tools into earlier times, unaware that he was creating a historical mirage. Critics counter that the rarity of astrolabes reflects their elite status, not their absence. But Illig noted that in centuries brimming with monastic astronomy and maritime trade, even rare tools should leave a more continuous trail. Instead, the astrolabe of the phantom centuries feels like a shadow moving against the wall, there for a moment, gone the next. Chapter 22. The weather that wasn't history is written in ink and memory, but climate is written in wood and ice. In the forests, each ring of a tree tells the story of a year, its warmth, its droughts, its storms. In the ice caps, layers preserve traces of volcanic ash, trapped bubbles of air, and the faint signatures of seasons long past. These records are patient witnesses, indifferent to human ambitions. When scientists compare these natural archives to the written history of the phantom centuries, they sometimes find mismatches. Chronicles describe years of famine caused by harsh winters, yet the tree rings from that era show no sign of climatic stress. Conversely, a major volcanic eruption identified in ice core data leaves no mention in the chronicles of the supposed time. Illig seized on these mismatches as possible evidence that events had been misdated or invented to populate the phantom years. If the eruption happened in 1100, but was placed by chroniclers in 800, the geological and textual records would naturally fall out of sync. Skeptics suggest that medieval chroniclers were provincial. A famine in one region might not appear in the climate record of another. Yet Illig's point remains unsettling. When we step away from human accounts and let nature tell the story, the phantom centuries sound different or not at all. Chapter 23. Saints who never were. In the quiet of a medieval chapel, light filters through colored glass to fall upon a painted figure. A saint whose eyes are lifted toward heaven, whose life is told in carved panels along the wall, hagiographies. The lives of saints were among the most popular and influential writings of the Middle Ages. They inspired faith, legitimized relics, and bound local communities together. But some saints of the phantom centuries seem suspiciously like echoes. Their miracles closely resemble those of older saints, their journeys retrace familiar paths, their very names hint at duplication. Illig wondered whether these figures were invented to fill the blank space of invented years. A monastery might claim to have been founded by a saint in 725, granting it prestige and a holy pedigree, even if the actual founding was centuries later. The repetition of miracle stories is particularly striking. A vision by a riverbank, a healing with a single touch, a storm stilled by prayer. These appear across saints' lives like refrains in a song. Were they evidence of shared faith and tradition, or signs of authors reusing familiar tales to give weight to figures who never lived? For Illig, these saints were the human face of phantom time, beautiful fictions, born of devotion and political need, living only in the pages of history that may itself be an invention. Chapter 24. The phantom wars are loud in the record. They leave fortifications, mass graves, weapon caches, and the scars of siege on city walls. Yet some wars of the phantom centuries leave behind little more than words. Take certain campaigns of Charlemagne, which supposedly stretched across vast swathes of Europe. Chroniclers speak of decisive battles and conquered peoples, but archaeological evidence is thin. In some cases there are no battlefields to be found, no layers of destruction in the cities said to have fallen. Illig proposed that some of these wars were literary constructions, invented to add weight to rulers' reputations or to populate the phantom centuries with plausible events. Others might have been real conflicts from different times, shifted backward or forward to fit a politically useful narrative. Critics suggest that many medieval battles were small skirmishes, leaving little trace. But Illig countered that over centuries, even minor wars should accumulate physical evidence. In the phantom centuries, the silence is too complete, as though entire campaigns marched only on the parchment, never on the earth. Chapter 25. The art that skipped a beat. Art changes with time, in style and technique, in subject and symbolism. These changes are usually gradual, visible in the steady drift from one generation to the next. But in the phantom centuries, some art seems to leap across time. Decorative motifs vanish for hundreds of years, only to reappear suddenly. Stylistic elements show abrupt shifts, as though the artist skipped over intermediate stages of development. Illig saw this as another sign of a compressed timeline. If certain centuries never happened, then the art we attribute to them is either misplaced from another period, or entirely misdated. The result is the illusion of stylistic jumps that make little sense in a continuous historical flow. A carved cross from Ireland, dated to the mid-8th century, might share more in common with works from the 11th century than with those supposedly from the decades between. A Byzantine mosaic may show a sudden refinement of technique, without the gradual experimentation that should precede it. For Illig, art was a mirror that occasionally betrayed the lie, showing not a smooth reflection of time but the jagged edges where history had been cut and rejoined. Chapter 26. The Ghost Empires. To understand the full weight of the phantom time hypothesis, we must look beyond Europe's borders. If 300 years were invented in the West, what would this mean for the empires of Africa, Asia, and the Middle East? Take the Abbasid Caliphate, said to have been founded in 750 AD. In the phantom centuries, it becomes one of the most influential powers in the Islamic world, ruling from Baghdad and fostering the golden age of Islamic science, philosophy, and art. If Illig is right, some of these cultural triumphs might be misplaced in time, shifted forward or backward, their true origin concealed. And what of the Tang dynasty in China, which supposedly flourished during much of the phantom period? Chinese historical records are among the most meticulous in the world, with detailed chronicles stretching back millennia. If their records align with events in Europe during the phantom years, this could undermine Illig's theory. But if discrepancies exist, subtle mismatches in astronomical events, trade records, or diplomatic exchanges, they could be clues to a deeper global compression of time. Africa too would feel the tremor. The kingdom of Aksum in modern-day Ethiopia is said to have declined during the 7th century. If the phantom period never happened, its fall may have been much closer to the present than we believe, altering the timelines of trade and religious conversion across the Horn of Africa. For Illig, this global angle is both the greatest challenge and the most tantalizing opportunity. If phantom time exists, it must echo across continents, and if it does not, those same continents may be the ones to prove it. Chapter 27. The Forgotten Farmers. While kings and emperors shape the visible peaks of history, it is farmers who create its foundation. Every field tilled, every seed sown, is a mark on the timeline. Agricultural practices in Europe during the phantom centuries are curiously stable. The heavy plough, three-field crop rotation, and improved harnessing methods are all said to emerge gradually across the early Middle Ages. But when examined closely, some of these gradual changes appear almost abrupt. In a normal historical flow, innovation spread unevenly, leaving behind a patchwork of adoption rates in the archaeological record. But if centuries were fabricated, then what we see as slow evolution might instead be a leap. One moment wooden scratch plows dominate, the next heavy iron plows are everywhere. Livestock breeding tells a similar tale. The genetic diversity of medieval cattle, sheep, and pigs suggests shifts in breeding practices that seem compressed in time. If these changes took place over a shorter period than recorded, it would be another subtle sign that the centuries in between are thinner than we think. It is here, in the soil and in the bones of animals, that phantom time leaves perhaps its most humble and most telling marks. Chapter 28. Pilgrimages through time. The Middle Ages were an age of holy journeys. Pilgrims set out on foot, across mountains and deserts, to kneel before relics, to light candles in cathedrals, to fulfill vows made in moments of desperation or gratitude. The most famous routes, to Santiago de Compostela, to Canterbury, to Rome, are mapped in modern guidebooks with an air of timelessness. But when we examine their origins, the timelines grow murky. Some shrines said to have been founded in the 8th or 9th centuries show architectural features that belong firmly in the 11th or 12th. The earliest surviving guesthouses for pilgrims along certain routes appear later than we would expect if those paths were already in heavy use. And then there is the problem of relics. If a relic is documented in 780, but stylistic analysis suggests its reliquary was made in the 1000s, which date do we believe? Is the earlier one a fabrication to give the shrine prestige? Or is the object older and merely rehoused? If phantom time were real, some of Europe's most beloved pilgrimages might not be as ancient as they seem, their early history a story told in hindsight to make them feel eternal. Chapter 29. The lost invention's invention is rarely a single leap. It is a chain of trial and error, each improvement building on the last. But in the phantom centuries, some inventions appear suddenly, without the expected trail of prototypes. Take the stirrup, a simple yet transformative tool for cavalry warfare. The stirrup is believed to have reached Europe by the early 8th century, but its rapid integration into military practice seems oddly swift, almost too swift for an age with slow communication and travel. Similarly, certain watermill designs appear earlier than expected in the historical record, then vanish, only to reappear centuries later. Were these early mentions anachronistic insertions into the phantom years, their true development belonging to a later period? Even in medicine, some texts attributed to the phantom centuries contain knowledge that seems out of place, anticipating techniques that should not have been known for generations. If they were copied later and dated to earlier times, it would explain both the advanced content and the lack of intermediate works leading to it. For Illig, the phantom centuries are like a room where the furniture is wrong for the architecture. Beautiful pieces, but arranged in a way that betrays their true age. Chapter 30. The letters that don't fit in an age before printing. Every letter was a physical object, crafted by hand. Charters, deeds, treaties, and personal correspondence carry the fingerprints of their time, not just in content, but in handwriting, ink composition, and even the way the parchment was prepared. Document analysts have noted inconsistencies in some materials dated to the phantom centuries. A charter from 840 might use ink formulas common in the 12th century. A legal contract might feature letter forms that belong to a later stage of script evolution. Mainstream historians often explain these as later copies, a perfectly reasonable practice in monasteries and royal chanceries. But Illig raises the uncomfortable question. What if they are not copies at all, but original creations pretending to be older than they are? Even the language within these documents can betray them. Certain legal phrases, idioms, or rhetorical structures appear out of place, more at home in later centuries. If phantom time were indeed a deliberate fabrication, forgers would have relied on their own present-day language and materials, unaware of the subtle markers that future scholars might one day read, like the telltale brushstrokes of a forged painting. Chapter 31. Shadows in the East. To truly test the phantom time hypothesis, we must look beyond Europe's self-contained story and into the chronicles of the East, the vast libraries of China, Japan, and the Islamic world. The Tang dynasty in China supposedly overlapped much of the phantom centuries. Chinese historians were meticulous, recording celestial events, floods, famines, and diplomatic missions in an unbroken stream. If these records match Europe's phantom period perfectly, Illig's theory falters. But if mismatches appear, say, a European eclipse dated to 755 that Chinese astronomers recorded in 1020, it could hint at a deeper anomaly. In Japan, the Nara and early Heian periods are documented with imperial records, temple logs, and court poetry. Some of these line up awkwardly with events in Europe, while others are eerily silent during supposed years of major cross-cultural contact. The Abbasid Caliphate in the Islamic world is another puzzle. It thrived during the phantom centuries, sending scholars to translate Greek texts and merchants to trade across the known world. If its internal records can be independently dated, through astronomy or dendrochronology, they could confirm or contradict Europe's timeline. The challenge for Illig's theory is that the East's records often do not share Europe's gaps. Yet in rare cases, they too show odd silences or overlaps. Whether these are coincidences, lost archives, or hints of a shared global compression, remains one of the theory's most tantalizing questions. Chapter 32. The Missing Plagues Disease is one of history's most reliable timestamps. Plagues leave behind mass graves, written accounts of panic, and sudden population drops in the archaeological record. The early medieval period was no stranger to disease. The plague of Justinian in the 6th century killed millions, and later pandemics ravaged towns and villages. Yet the phantom centuries are curiously light on confirmed, large-scale epidemics. A few are mentioned in chronicles, but often without specific symptoms or medical detail. In contrast, later medieval plagues are described with grim precision: the black swellings of the Black Death, the fevers of typhoid, the wasting of famine-borne sickness. If phantom time were fabricated, inserting epidemics into it would require credible detail, something medieval forgers may have lacked. They could borrow from biblical plagues or earlier accounts, but without medical knowledge, the results might feel vague or repetitive. Some skeletal remains from supposed phantom century cemeteries show no signs of epidemic death, suggesting either that the plagues described never occurred, or that they were later misdated events from real centuries. In the absence of unmistakable plague pits, Illig sees another shadow in the phantom years. Chapter 33. Bones that tell no story. Cemeteries are the most democratic of archives. Kings and paupers alike rest beneath the soil, their bones carrying traces of age, disease, diet, and ancestry. Archaeologists studying early medieval cemeteries sometimes find that skeletal populations seem to skip generational markers. In a continuous community, changes in stature, bone density, or disease prevalence happen slowly. But in the phantom centuries, shifts can seem abrupt. Carbon dating is often used to anchor these remains in time, but Illig points out that radiocarbon calibration curves can produce clustered dates, particularly in the early Middle Ages, that leave room for reinterpretation. If 3 centuries never occurred, then the bones we think belong to 800 AD might truly belong to 1100, their placement on the timeline, an artifact of calibration quirks and assumption. To most scholars this is speculative at best, but Illig maintains that human remains, silent as they are, may be the most honest record keepers we have, and in their silence, they hint at the absence of the years they are said to have lived through. Chapter 34. The music that skipped a note. Music evolves like language, slowly, influenced by geography, culture, and innovation. The early medieval period is said to have birthed the roots of Gregorian chant, a style that would dominate church music for centuries. Yet the leap from the plain vocal traditions of the late Roman world to the highly structured chants of the High Middle Ages feels unusually short when confined to the phantom centuries. Surviving manuscripts of notation, rare to begin with, cluster in the later end of the period, as if the earlier centuries had little to offer or left nothing behind. Instruments too seem to appear without gradual refinement. The harp, the organ, and certain woodwinds leap into the record fully formed, with few clear ancestral forms in the phantom years. If phantom time were real, the music we attribute to 800 AD might instead belong to 1100. Its style not the product of 3 centuries of careful evolution, but the output of a single, more compressed cultural moment. To the casual listener, this makes no difference, but to historians of music, it leaves a dissonant chord that refuses to resolve. Chapter 35. If time was stolen, who paid the price? If 300 years of history were fabricated, the question becomes, who paid for the theft? Generations would have been shifted out of their place in the story. Some would have had their lives pulled forward, their descendants reassigned to different centuries. Borders might have been drawn on maps centuries too early or too late. Wars fought in the real world might have been renamed or forgotten entirely. But perhaps the greatest cost would have been to memory itself. Communities passed down stories of ancestors, of founding events, of disasters survived. If the official timeline shifted, those stories could be edited, merged, or quietly dropped until they no longer fit anywhere at all. Illig's theory, whether right or wrong, forces us to think about time not as a neutral backdrop, but as something curated, even manufactured. If years can be invented, then history becomes less like a river and more like a tapestry, one where threads can be removed, replaced, or dyed a different color without anyone noticing until centuries later. And if that is possible, what else might have been altered, hidden, or erased, without us ever knowing? Chapter 36. The vanishing trade routes. Trade is the circulatory system of civilization. It carries not just goods but ideas, technologies, and styles across continents. And yet, when historians trace Europe's trade routes during the phantom centuries, the arteries seem to narrow. The great Roman roads, lifelines of commerce, were said to have fallen into disrepair by the 7th century. But the revival of long-distance trade, as seen in later medieval markets, appears too abrupt if we believe 3 centuries passed in between. Archaeological evidence for sustained overland trade during the phantom years is thin. Few new ports appear, few road repairs are documented, and the distribution of foreign goods is patchy. In contrast, records after 911 show sudden expansions, bustling market towns, more coins in circulation, and a rapid diversification of imported wares. To Illig, this suggests not a revival after a long dormancy, but a continuation disguised as a gap. Trade routes that never truly withered, but whose intermediate history was erased, leaving a false impression of decline and miraculous recovery. Chapter 37. The churches out of time. Churches are anchors in the landscape of history. Built to last, they preserve the styles, materials, and craftsmanship of their era. Yet some churches attributed to the phantom centuries carry stylistic elements from much later periods. A Romanesque arch where an earlier rounded one should be, a masonry technique not yet in use during the date of supposed construction. These anomalies accumulate like quiet whispers against the official story. Radiocarbon dating of wood beams, mortar analysis, and dendrochronology have occasionally suggested later construction dates than the written records claim. Some defenders say this is due to rebuilding or restoration, but Illig's theory offers a different possibility. The original build date was never real. If this is true, many beloved ancient churches may be younger than their anniversaries suggest. Their stone foundations, sitting in the gap between history as it happened and history as it was written. Chapter 38. The feasts that never happened. Medieval calendars were not just tools for measuring time, they were maps of celebration. Feast days, saint days, and agricultural festivals punctuated the year, shaping the rhythm of community life. When scholars reconstruct the medieval liturgical calendar for the phantom centuries, something peculiar appears. Certain feast days are recorded as ancient traditions, yet the earliest solid evidence for their observance comes much later. If phantom time were real, some of these ancient feasts could have been invented after the fact, backdated to give them weight. Their early history might be nothing more than a story told by the Church to unify the faithful under a shared sense of heritage. In this way, even joy itself, the music, processions, and fires of a holy day, could be part of the illusion, celebrated in centuries that never existed. Chapter 39. The architecture without ancestors. Architectural styles grow like trees, each branch emerging from the one before it. Yet in the phantom centuries, certain buildings seem to sprout without clear predecessors. Some fortifications appear with design elements that, in a continuous timeline, should have taken decades to develop. Others show construction techniques absent from earlier structures but common in later ones, as if they skipped a generational step in building knowledge. Illig suggests that these jumps are the result of misdated construction, that buildings from the late 10th or early 11th century were placed in the phantom gap to fill an empty architectural record. To stand in such a building is to feel its defiance of the timeline. The stones may not speak, but they hum with the dissonance of an age that perhaps never was. Chapter 40. The stars out of sequence. The sky is the ultimate timekeeper. Stars shift in position over centuries due to the slow wobble of Earth's axis, a movement called precession. Ancient and medieval astronomers recorded star positions with enough accuracy that modern science can determine when those measurements must have been taken. When certain medieval star charts are dated according to precession, some do not align with the years they are said to represent. Illig saw in this a cosmic clue. If the stars and the written dates disagree, perhaps the written dates are wrong. Mainstream scholars attribute these discrepancies to copying errors, misinterpretations, or the limited accuracy of early instruments. But for Illig, they are the silent testimony of the heavens, hinting that human calendars may not match the universe's own clock. In a way, the stars themselves become witnesses against phantom time, or perhaps its only impartial judges. Conclusion: a soft fade into the past. And so we arrive at the end of our journey, or perhaps not the end, but a place where the path dissolves into fog. The phantom time hypothesis may be wrong in its details. Most historians would say it is. And yet, walking through its corridors has revealed something valuable. A heightened awareness of how fragile our connection to the past truly is. Time feels immutable. A river flowing steadily from the mountains of antiquity to the sea of the present. But in truth, the river can be diverted, dammed, even drained, not by the movement of planets, but by the decisions of people. Whether or not 300 years was stolen from our history, we live with the reality that the past we inherit is always a version, shaped by choices, omissions, and interpretations. There is no untouched original, no perfect record. There are only layers, some authentic, some altered, all pressing down upon us like sediment. As the candle gutters low and the last embers of the fire wink in the hearth, we close the book on this strange, unsettling possibility. The library around us is silent, the shelves heavy with volumes that may hold as much invention as truth. Perhaps tomorrow we will open another, and find more shadows lurking between the lines. For now, we let the weight of centuries, real or imagined, settle over us. And in the quiet we drift into sleep, carrying with us the haunting thought that time itself may not be what it seems.